Daniel, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. How are you?
Hey, I'm good. It's a pleasure to be with you from here in my home office in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and it's good to see that you've got lots of distinguished books in the background as well. Some of them, obviously, are of your own creation as well, which I suppose leads me really neatly into the conversation we're having today. So, I'm a big fan of all of your work, as
Thank
I'm
you.
sure a lot of people tell you. What I really like about your work is you kind of capture the human condition, but you talk about the things that are below the surface that actually we don't even know about, and the research that you inject into it is so fascinating. But the book I want to kind of hone in on today is To Sell is Human, which obviously was
Okay.
published I think in 2012. To kick us off with, what was it that kind of ignited the interest in you jumping into the murky and interesting world of sales?
It was a few things. There's an old adage, and I think you can find this with a lot of my books. But there's an old adage in scientific research that all research is me search. So a lot of it begins with me, and so there were two observations that I made that were really the catalyst for this book. The first was an observation about myself, and that I noticed that I was spending enormous amounts of time selling, and not necessarily selling books, but just like trying to get people on some nonprofit board to go with my point of view than another point of view, trying to get somebody to join a project that I was working on, convincing, persuading, cajoling. The cash register wasn't ringing. There was not necessarily an exchange of money, but it was a selling thing. And I was like, crap. I was like, I'm a writer. I'm not a salesperson, but maybe I'm a salesperson. And then the second thing is that when I, at that point, when this book came out, which is 8 or 9 years ago, when that book came out, I had been writing about business for maybe 10 or 15 years. And one of the things that I noticed, and in the course of that, I had interviewed a lot of people who were salespeople, people who had sales on their business card, in their signature file, in their job title. And what I noticed is that these people were really smart. These people were not like the kind of stereotype that a lot of smarty pants have about salespeople. Like, these are some of the savviest, sharpest people I met. And I was like, that's kind of weird. And that took me on this thing to try to explore, what is sales today, and why, and try to validate my hunch that all of us in some ways are doing this.
Yeah, and I really like the way actually that you broaden the circle on selling. You don't necessarily say, although a lot of it is spoken about people in traditional sales roles, but a lot of the research you've done actually, in fact, some of the research you did yourself, um, tells us that actually there's a component of selling or moving people throughout
Absolutely.
almost all roles at the moment, which is really interesting because I've always been of the perception that sales is just a microcosm of communication, right? That's fundamentally all it is, right? So this is quite interesting because I personally think that some of the best literature that's come out about selling has come from people who aren't salespeople. So whether
Mm.
that's like spin selling in 1988 from Neil Rackham, who was obviously a researcher, the wonderful work that Brent and Matt Dixon did around Challenger Sell. What
Yep.
do you think the unique vantage point you had as someone who wasn't from a traditional sales background gave you when writing about selling?
I think I had less to unlearn. I think that's a big part of it. That and I think part of it is that writing about, if I had written a book about this, if I had written it, say, 15 years earlier, I think it would have been a very different book. Certainly 20 years earlier, because you know as I argue in this book, the world of sales, persuasion, convincing, cajoling, influence, etc., has changed more in the last 15 years than in the last 1500 years. That is, there's been a massive shift in information. And as I say in the book, and as you know, Aaron, most of what we know about sales has come from a world of information asymmetry, where the seller has more information than the buyer. That's true in selling per se, and it's true in this broader view of sales. Almost all persuasion, influence, selling has come from a world where the seller had more information than the buyer. And that created a certain set of circumstances. That created a certain ethic. It created almost a kind of muscle memory, a certain set of cultural values. Most profoundly embodied in the principle of buyer beware. Buyers had to beware because sellers had such an advantage. But I mean, it's pretty amazing. In the last 15 years, we've moved much, 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 much closer to information parity. And that is, and as I say many times, that is not a difference in degree. That is a difference in kind. It's a different enterprise altogether. So I think I had the good fortune of exploring this topic at a moment, at kind of a hinge moment where things were changing pretty substantially.
Yeah, that particular piece around information asymmetry really stood out to me because I think the pendulum may have swung the other way over the last, certainly the last couple of years, where
Tell
because
me
the
what you mean.
buyer, yeah, well, the buyer now has so much information and too much information. And you make the great point about this: the modern seller should actually curate the information
Right.
for the buyer, which I love, by the way, because I think it ratified a lot of my thinking and also taught me a lot as well. But what we're finding now from some research that we've certainly studied is that there's now a different expectation from the buyer, which is when I speak to the salesperson now, I want them to teach me something that I didn't know before. I want them to basically challenge my perception and my thinking, whereas they're
Mm.
almost asking for the information asymmetry to go back to what it was before, right? Which was the salesperson being the gatekeeper to all the information, which I found really interesting. Um, so yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have any perceptions on that, or whether that came up in the research that you were doing.
Not really. I mean, I think that I think that it's complicated, and and in my answer to the previous question, I took pains to say we're moving closer to information parity, not that we've achieved information parity, and I do think there's been a uh, I think there's been a different kind of counter move. One of them is just the huge amount of information that is out there. I think has made the curatorial function much more important, as you said before. And I actually think that the advent of the generative AI, particularly um, generative AI mixed with search engine function, is going to do some of that curatorial work big time. There is an American political um, aide, a kind of a rabble rouser, not a particularly ethical guy. He advised Donald Trump. His name is Steve Bannon. I don't know how well known he is in the UK. And his strategy politically was, and I'm going to quote him now. It was to his words. The secret was to flood the zone with shit, so people don't believe anything. And I think that that's a bigger issue right now. I think that it's not so much information overload. It's that bad actors have and will continue to flood the zone with shit. So the role has to be, not only to curate information, which sounds like dainty and noble, but also to become a kind of a shit filter, to keep those things out. I think that to me is the biggest change since I've written the book.
It's really interesting, yeah. And again, I think it's certainly something that we're seeing playing out because confusion amongst buyers and their inability to make a decision
Yeah,
is at like fever pitch at the moment. And the role that the salesperson can play, as you say, is actually go, well, look, you should probably ignore all of that. You should focus on this over
yeah.
here.
Yeah. I still think that the curatorial function is incredibly important. I think that I had, and when I wrote the book, I had a slightly more pristine version of that. Because if you think about the very metaphor of curation, curation is like you have things that are sort of seemingly worthy, and you're going to pick out the most worthy things in there. I think what's happened now is that when bad actors flood the zone with shit, you're not you're doing kind of a cleanup act. You're doing something that is a little bit less less pristine. But I actually do think that on the curatorial point, if any of your listeners have played around with the combination of the sort of the GPT-3 chat function on the search engine Bing connected to the search engine function itself, I think that is going to play a pretty significant curatorial role. And it could be that the best salespeople are the best at writing the prompts to allow the AI to do that initial curatorial function.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say that because I interviewed someone the other day and they basically went on to ChatGTP and said, tell me why I shouldn't buy XYZ and put the product name in there. and it brought
Interesting.
up a laundry list reasons why not. But they're actually now using that as a mechanism to be honest, God forbid, right, with the prospect and say, hey, here's typically why people might not
That's
consider it
fascinating.
because of this. Exactly right. It's kind of telling them what they're not and telling them what they should look out for when they're doing their own research, which leads really neatly into the point that you made there
Yeah.
about using that to help with the curatorial point as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Aaron. The other thing about that I thought of is, so a salesperson could use that and say, I'm selling this, I have this particular offering. Tell me the five most common objections you expect to hear, and then you actually get a preview of those objections, and then you can start working to, how do you overcome those objections? I think that's actually quite interesting. I think one of the things that it does, though, again, I think one of the things that it does, and I haven't, I really haven't thought a lot about the generative AI and its effect on sales, but I think it's going to be pretty significant, is that, again, for people in the pure sales function, I think it's, once again, one of the things that we've seen in the last 10 or 15, certainly in the last 15 years, is that prospects of any kind, consumer or B2B prospects, potential customers, are coming into the sales process way later. And way later in the process. So the salespeople themselves are actually encountering the prospect much later in the process than they did even 10 or 15 years ago. I think that generative AI might actually have the prospects entering even later into the process, and I think that changes things considerably.
Yeah, and it's one of the challenges we face at the moment is because we're trying to run a sales process, if you will, that's 10, 15 years old. But actually, by the time that we
Oh,
speak to the
interesting.
buyer now, yeah, I mean that we're trying to take them through steps that they've already gone through themselves, and it's frustrating for the buyer. There was a statistic that came out recently, which was frankly staggering, which was 72% of buyers would prefer a rep-free experience. They'd rather buy it on their own without ever speaking to a salesperson. And to your point, I think we've got to find a way of encountering the buyer early on and adding more value early on as well. Which actually leads me really neatly into my next question, actually, because what we're talking about here is the perception of salespeople. Now, I'm guessing that when you went into this, you probably carried some baggage around what salespeople were like and the kind of typical stuff which you call out in the book. But you also spent a lot of time with salespeople, and there's a really touching story about you spending time with the cleaning products sales guy
Oh,
as well, which is brilliant because it's kind of a central thread throughout the book. He stays in focus as the book progresses. What what perceptions changed, or did you have any change in perception when you went through this journey of writing the book about salespeople specifically?
Thank you for saying that. Thank you for noticing that was a through line through the book. Not everybody has noticed that narrative is a through line through the book. It's something I tried hard to do, and it's often invisible to less astute readers than you. So thank you for that. I guess there were two things. One is that, as I said, I launched into this in part because of this kind of cognitive dissonance that I had between, sort of what I had heard about sales and what I actually saw with my own eyes. So at some level, my perceptions were already beginning to change. That I was already questioning the stereotype, and my questioning of the stereotype was in some ways the impetus for this whole line of research. The second thing that I took away, I mean, it's a less sort of insight. Maybe it's less insightful, but just how freaking hard it is. It's a really hard job. It's a really hard job. It's harder than most people realize. And especially when I started talking about, rejection, and and the number of times people have to knock on doors and not get their phone call returned and all of that, it is difficult. And I don't think there's enough of an appreciation for the kind of both the intellectual acuity it requires, but also just the pure tenacity that it requires. And when I look at professionals in other fields, I don't know if they have that tenacity. I don't think that many of them have built it up. I don't think many of them would last in this profession.
Yeah, you got to be a glutton for punishment. The way I describe it to people coming into selling is that imagine you've got a job as a carpenter, and every month you make the most beautiful chair, and then someone comes and destroys it in front of your eyes, and then you've got to go and make it again. It's like you've really got to, and the
Uh-huh.
funny thing about it is that you've got to start from zero every single month, and a lot of people aren't cut out for it. You have to be a sociopath to do it. You really to do it effectively.
Yeah. But again, I actually think that there's going to be some. I think that you can't assume that that is necessarily going to be the norm forever. So if you that the thing what you're doing where it's like, okay, on the 31st of the month I go back to zero, and then I have to hit my numbers for the next month, and then I go back to zero, and then I mean, if you look at something like especially complex business to business sales, um, um, that and actually Matt Dixon has wrote about it, some of this. We sort of at least touched on this in a little bit in Challenger Sale. If you look at complex business to business sales, first things that are high ticket, things that are complicated offerings, things where the sales cycle, the sales process is very, very long. That's basically management consulting, what they're doing. I mean, you know what I mean? It's like they have to understand what the business needs. They have to understand the business in some ways better than, as well as, if not better than, the people making the decision. They have to understand the overall context of that industry, what that individual company's strengths and weaknesses are, how this whatever they're selling fits into their overall strategy, and it's management consulting, man, and so it's less of that kind of zero. It's much more intellectually sophisticated, and it's less of that zeroing out every month that you would have at, say, an American car dealership, or people selling copying machines into offices.
Yeah, I mean those enterprise sales are almost a battle of attrition in some ways. I mean, because you just become part of their business because you're working with them for like sometimes 2 years before the
Exactly.
paper. So it's always interesting. Now the book itself, and actually the majority of your books, actually, the research that you go into is so fascinating, and actually how you borrow research um, in areas that you wouldn't expect. Like as an example, like the piece around rhyming
Oh
in
yeah.
Human, so fascinating. I guess the question is, and you pack it with research, but the books are so succinct and they're so direct, and there's no fluff in your books. They're very much to the point.
Thanks. I
Was
appreciate
there
that.
was there was there any research that was kind of left on the cutting room floor, either research that you undertook yourself, or research that you curated throughout the book as well?
Um, I don't think so. I mean, there's always new research coming out. I think that's the thing that's interesting. So I don't think this is in the book, um, but there's some interesting research on. I mean, I use this myself. Is some research on the number of claims that you should make to persuade somebody. So, if I'm making an argument to you, is one argument better than zero arguments? Yes. Is two arguments better than one argument? Yes. Is three arguments better than two arguments? Yes. Is four arguments better than three arguments? No. That there is something about the three that is just, I find that endlessly fascinating, because you see it in drama, you see it in joke telling. So that kind of, so it's not so much that there was stuff left on the cutting room floor. It's just that there are other all kinds of new research always coming out, especially on things like linguistic framing. That's become a bigger deal now. Um, the whole world of behavioral economics has done some very interesting research on, choice architecture and how people make decisions in that regard. So it's an endlessly interesting field.
Sounds like you've got a follow up to the book in you already, Daniel.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
I was going to say, do you fancy rolling up your sleeves and probably trouser legs again and getting into sales again? Probably not. I think you've probably had more
I
than
don't know.
enough.
I don't know. I don't know.
The other thing which I loved about the book, because I thought it was quite cheeky, is the way that you reappropriated ABC, which is uh, classic sales wisdom will say of always be closing, and you obviously have changed it to attunement, buoyancy, and clarity, which I absolutely love. By the way, I think it's really really cool.
Thanks.
For anyone who hasn't read the book, like just talk us through that piece around attunement, buoyancy, and clarity. Did you have that in your mind, or was it like a backronym that you worked backwards from to create ABC?
Absolutely, the latter. I discovered it. I didn't seek it out. I in some ways I kind of lucked out. Like it was more luck than design, honestly, on that. It was basically following the evidence. So to take two steps backward, the animating arguments of the book are twofold. First, as we've discussed, everybody's in sales, whether they like it or not. And that's the way that the modern white collar workforce is like. And second is that, as we also discussed, we're carrying out these tasks in a completely remade landscape, a landscape much closer to information parity than information asymmetry, a world much closer to seller beware than buyer beware. Okay, so that calls for a different set of abilities. Now, the bad news is that no one is out there doing research at business school saying, how do I sell ethically and effectively in a world of information parity? That research is not happening. But as you suggest, Aaron, there's a lot of other research out there in a whole array of fields, giving us kind of micro tools, micro sort of tiles in a mosaic, in a sense, that help us understand and see that, how to do that more effectively. And as I tried to make sense of all that research, it seemed like there were three overarching abilities that seemed most important, qualities. And so one was attunement. Attunement is, that's the A. Attunement is, can you get out of your own head and see things from someone else's point of view? Profoundly important in any kind of persuasive element. That is, can I understand where you're coming from? Can I see your point of view? Can I understand your interests? And can I find common ground? It's more than empathy. It's more cognitive than simply feeling what someone is feeling. It is understanding their perspective. It's something that human beings are not natively good at, but it's something we can get a lot better at. And I think it's essential. It's at some level on this one, on attunement. I actually think today, I think it's even more important than I thought it was when I wrote the book. So that's attunement. Second one, which we've hinted at a little bit, is buoyancy. B. The fellow Norman Hall, whom you mentioned, the brush salesman, had this lovely, very poetic line where he says, every day I face an ocean of rejection. I love that phrase. And I wish I had come up with that, an ocean of rejection. And so buoyancy is, how do you stay afloat in that ocean of rejection? And we know from some very interesting social science that there are ways to get better at, responding to rejection, responding to failure, staying afloat in that ocean of rejection. And then the third one is C is clarity. And we've also touched on that a little bit. Those are two different things. And I think this is I think remains a big deal. One of them is this. The move from many salespeople tend to think of themselves as, often will call themselves problem solvers. I'm not selling, I'm solving a problem. And that's okay. But as you suggested before, you use that 72% figure. 72% of people would like to do it without a salesperson. And that's typically the case when they know precisely what their problem is. When they know exactly what their problem is, they can often solve it on their own. So salespeople are more valuable when the buyer, the prospect, doesn't know what their problem is, or, as is often the case, is wrong about their problem. A lot of times buyers don't know what they want. They're wrong about what they need. And so the premium has shifted from the skill of problem solving to the skill of problem finding. Okay, this is a big deal. From problem solving to problem finding. Can you identify hidden needs, latent problems? Can you find problems that people don't realize that they have, or see around corners, or see down the road, and anticipate problems they're going to have? And so that's one aspect of clarity. And the second one is, this is also, I think, significant culturally, just in terms of how the world works, is that we've gone from a world from accessing information to curating information. We talked about this a moment ago. It used to be that the very nature of expertise, what made somebody an expert in some ways, or at least one of the things that made somebody an expert, was that person had access to information that no one else had. But now that's becoming less and less the case. in fact, we have the opposite problem, as you said, is that we got this surfeit of information. And so the skill has shifted from accessing information to curating information. So when we line up the abilities that are most necessary, honestly, it's more luck than anything else. It's a new set of ABCs. It's attunement, attunement, out of your own head into someone else's head. B, buoyancy, stay afloat in that ocean of rejection. C, clarity, go from accessing information to curating it, from solving existing problems to identifying hidden problems. And I think that gives us, I think, a pretty sound map for figuring out what people need to do to be effective and ethical sellers, whether they're selling, they're enterprise salespeople selling gigantic computer systems, or they're somebody selling, flowers at a farmer's market.
Yeah, there's so much in there which is brilliant in the book, and what you've just said there as well. I think the piece you mentioned around sales being about problem finders, not problem solvers. When I first read the book, it was like a light switch had gone off in my brain, because we're taught in selling that we're always trying to find the solution. Where actually what we should be doing is let the customer think about what they don't know what the problem is. Help them realize unrecognized needs. Let them know what those icebergs in the distance are, and that's where they'll get the true value from the salesperson. Kind of what we were talking about before of what buyers expect from sellers. And this is why the book, in a weird way, was kind of ahead of its time where we're moving into now. And I appreciate you referencing that when you say it's becoming more relevant, actually, as times change, because this is being borne out in research that's coming out now. The second point you made around, and I find this really interesting about you specifically, and I did the E on my head, actually. I was reading the book, or listening to the book on my audiobook, and I was running on my treadmill, and I nearly fell off my treadmill drawing the E on my head, which is one of the exercises which is in the book, which is great, by the way. You seem to have a unique ability to understand humans, and actually a way of looking outside of your perception and looking at other humans. And I've heard you mention this in interviews in the past, but how does that come about? How are you so good at finding perceptions of other people? What makes you so good?
Well,
at that?
You're kind to say that. I think that a lot of it has to do. I think a lot of it has to do with just doing the work. You know, um, there's sort of a, in the last few years, there have been people who, popular writers like me, general writers like me, non-science, people who aren't scientists themselves, and what they do is they, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the science of X, Y, or Z, and I'm going to read four papers, and I don't even read those four papers. They read like the abstract of four papers. For my stuff, I read a shitload of stuff. And I go and I often will talk to the people who did the research, and I'll read it again. And some stuff I don't always understand the first time. So I'll do multiple readings, and I'll follow up in the footnotes, and I'll have piles and piles and piles of stuff. And I think that if you actually do the work to try to figure out, like, what do we really know? I think that's endlessly, it's arduous, but I think it yields insight. I really do. And so it's less about any kind of natural perceptive abilities than I have, than it is simply look at the evidence, follow the evidence, do the work, be rigorous in how you do the work, and you will produce insights. I really think that's the case.
Yeah, you're notoriously like the sort of Stanley Kubrick of authors, right? Where I hear that you write up to like 50 drafts of some of your books, and I heard that you even get your wife to read them back to you. Is that right? Just
yeah,
so
yeah.
you
Not
can...
so now. Okay, so now we've gone from sales to my own bizarre idiosyncrasies. But I do multiple drafts of things. I'm a very slow writer. It takes me a long time to like. It's why it's why I don't do a book every year like some people. It takes me a very long time. And you're exactly right that I for every book that I have, I will. You can guarantee that every word that you're seeing as a reader, that not only have I read it out loud at least once, but my wife has read it out loud to me at least once. and because that helps me. I just think that part of one of the things what we're part of what you do as a writer is, especially these kinds of books, is that you make it as simple and clear and concise as possible without compromising the integrity of the idea. And I feel like you can always get it a little sharper. You can always get it a little bit more, a little tighter. And you just have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. Because the way I look at it as a writer is that anybody, come on, someone is. I'm saying to somebody, go pay whatever it is, £10 or $20 for something that I did, and now go spend the next 7 hours with me rather than with someone else. It's like that's a high bar, man. You got to you got to deliver on that. And so I don't want to waste their time with fluff, as you say. I don't want to waste their time with even a sentence that doesn't help move the reader toward greater understanding or the ability to do things better in their own life.
Yeah, it comes across in the work because the books are really compact in a good way. Like they're very accessible, but there's like zero wasted words, there's zero wasted concepts, and they're really logical in the way that they flow, and they're so easy to read or listen to in some
Thanks.
cases as well.
Thank you.
It reminds me of the age old adage of I would have written a shorter letter, but I didn't have the time.
Exactly.
And that's yeah, it really
that's it. That's exactly it. It takes time to write short. It takes time to write shorter. That's one of my frustrations as a reader, is that there have been many times when I read books, especially in this genre of nonfiction, where it's like, okay, I'm basically reading your first draft. Like, I shouldn't be reading your first draft. I should be reading your sixth draft. And so I sort of feel cheated when that happens. I can guarantee you that anything that's published, I can guarantee you it is not anywhere close to the first draft that I've written. Nowhere
Well,
close.
So many authors I speak to have regrets of the final draft as well, where they, after the book comes out and when they speak to people more, they have some degree of regret as well. I assume that your ability to take other people's kind of points of view and look through their eyes was being a speechwriter, because I guess there must be an element of that when you're writing a speech for someone else, but maybe
Yeah,
I'm looking for the wrong things.
Maybe, yeah, no, I think so. I mean, I think that again, the other thing about it is, again, let's not honestly, Aaron, like, don't oversell the like you can have a more parsimonious explanation to all of this that relies less on my innate wonderfulness and more on some basic things, which is, like, number one, doing the work. Number two is just being curious about stuff, like wanting to figure stuff out. And as a writer, I think one of the most important thing, perhaps the most important thing, is figuring out what topic you want to write about, and writing about only things that you really want to know about and really care about. And that's not most things, So there are plenty of ideas that I have for books. I'm not going to freaking write that book because it would be miserable, and I'd write a bad book about it because I don't care that deeply about it. This is something that I was endlessly fascinated by. This is something, again, this book is like, whatever, 8 or 9 years old, and I'm totally psyched to talk about it right now. It's not like, oh my God, that came out a while ago, I don't want to talk about that anymore. I'm totally pumped to talk about it.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely getting your passion, Daniel. Don't worry. It's quite interesting because when I first reached out to you a few years ago, I remember saying to you, "Oh, I'd love you to have your guest on the podcast." You were like, "Oh, I'm writing something at the moment," and then you dropped The Power of Regret, and I was like, "Christ, I interrupted you while you're writing this masterpiece," which kind of leads me on to my next question. You've touched on so many interesting, very human topics, right? The selling one is particularly close to my heart because I've lived and breathed this for the last 20 years. What's next? What's the next thing that you're looking into where you're thinking, I really want to kind of look under the bonnet of this or look under the hood of this to make it more accessible for you? What's next?
Okay, first of all, for the rest of my life, I'm going to say look under the bonnet rather than look under the hood. That's a new expression to me. I prefer it. Second of all, I don't know yet. I'm trying to figure that out. There's again, it's a pretty, it takes, as I mentioned before, it takes me a long time to write books, and it's not like for me, just the way I do it, and is that I don't feel blissful the whole time, to put it mildly. So So, there's a pretty high bar. So I'm trying to figure that out. I mean, there are a bunch of things that I'm curious. There are a bunch of things that I'm curious about. Like, I mean, there's like, as we mentioned, that just generative AI is a big deal. Like all this stuff that we've heard in the last few years about crypto and metaverse. I was like, whatever. This gives me the kind of ripple up my spine that I had when I first saw like the World Wide Web, or when I first used email or a search engine. It's like, whoa, this is, or even, I mean, I'm old enough when I switched as a writer from an electric typewriter to a PC. It's like, whoa, this is a big deal. And so I think that generative AI is there. I don't know whether there's a book there, but it's something that I'm keenly curious about.
Yeah, I get that feeling about it as well. It reminds me of the internet when you first use it, and
Yeah,
you're like, I don't understand it, but it's pretty remarkable when you first see it.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
I suppose my final question as we draw this to a close is it's just an observation really, and I'm keen to get your perception on it, because having read a fair bit of your work, and also, like, I think not just in your writing but actually watching your talks, the way you talk is fantastic as well. And apologies if this is turning into like a schmaltzy like, gushing schmaltz fest. That's not the intention, but I get the feeling that you really care about humans. It comes through in your work that not only do you care about them, but you want the rest of us to make sense of being a human being. Is that fair to say, or have I massively
I mean,
misjudged that?
you're okay. So first of all, I think that you're overly kind, but I will concede there is an element of my purpose that is that truly. That is, I think that the initial impetus for doing stuff for me, there's sort of the initial impetus is very inner directed, in that I like to figure stuff out. All right, I like to look under the bonnet and say what's going on here and how can we understand it, and do we really understand it, and is there a new way to look at it that is more useful? And that's necessary but not sufficient. And but because if you what I also want is, I do want people who've given me this privilege of reading a book, buying a book and reading a book. I want them to see the world differently, but I want them to be able to do something differently. I want them to be able to take some kind of action, even if it's small, but do something so that, and maybe it's an existential cry to the universe on my part, but I want them to, you know what I mean? I want like their lives, and maybe I'm sort of grasping to have some kind of effect on their lives, so that somebody who reads the To Sell Is Human book says, wait a second, maybe I'm going to look at salespeople in a different way. Or maybe even on a smaller thing, it's like, oh my God, I totally understand why rhymes are more persuasive than things that aren't rhymes. So when I'm going to try to get my kid to take out the garbage, I'm going to have a rhyme, or I'm going to, get my team and I'm going to try to persuade them with a rhyme. Or, if this book on regret, it's like, well, wait a second, I'm thinking differently about my regret. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk to my team and tell them about a regret that I have, tell them what I learned from it, and tell them what I'm going to do about it. So it's, again, there's a sort of innerness where I am just motivated by trying to figure stuff out, but that's not quite enough. And I think in the service of figuring it out, I do want to try to equip people to see the world differently and maybe do one thing different in their own life.
That's great to hear, and all of your books have great utility as well. And I think To Sell Is Human is a prime example of that. I think any salesperson who's listening to this should buy the book and read it, because there's so much in there that you can start applying to not only your selling but actually communication in general. So I'm a big fan of it, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. Um, I follow you on Twitter. I follow you on LinkedIn. If people want to keep in touch with you and find out what you're doing and follow you, what's the best place?
You can go to my website, danpink.com, danpink.com. I have a newsletter that is a pretty good way to keep in touch. And we're going to, this year, 2023, try to revise and rejuvenate that newsletter a little bit, make it, a little bit more versatile, and a little bit more comprehensive, because we get very good traction on that newsletter. And I, myself, am not. I do post stuff on social media. It's like, but I'm not like totally into social media. I'm more into other kinds of stuff, and I'm still believing. I subscribe. I mean, myself, I subscribe to 94 email newsletters. So yeah, which is probably about 92 too many, but that's all right.
Awesome. I really like your big question series you're doing at the moment, where you're asking
Thanks,
those.
thanks. That's just another experiment in seeing what you can do. And in Sells Human, it talks about when you should persuade with questions and when you should persuade with statements.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's really got me thinking. I really like it. Well, thank you so much for
Thanks.
joining me and sharing your insight as well. So I appreciate the time, Daniel, and look forward to what you do next.
A pleasure, Aaron. Thanks for the great conversation. I enjoyed it.